We've got a caller, and I'd like to go to this caller, if that's all right with you. I think it is.
Yeah, totally ready.
It's Brett, he, him, coming out of the golden state of California, where they have proper springs and autumns. And Brett wants to talk about we
Hi,
use
Brett.
we use statistics incorrectly when trying to communicate problems with religious culture. That's what I have. But
Okay.
Brett, what does that mean? You're on Talk
What does
Heathen.
that mean?
Yeah, with Katy and Johnny. What you got?
Hello, and thank you for taking my call. I was actually surprised to be first up, being an atheist. This is a problem that I've been kind of beating my head against for a little while now. And it started with a study the Pew Research Center did on attitudes in Islamic cultures around the world. And they took this 4.5, 5-year-long study where they went to over 40 countries. They interviewed over 38,000 people. And they asked them about whether they support Sharia, and if they support Sharia, do they support Hunan punishments, which involve like cutting off the hand if you've stolen something, if they support the death penalty for apostasy or atheism. I mean, these are what I would consider to be fairly fundamental and important questions to wrap our minds around when talking to the moderate segment of Islamic populations worldwide. Now,
I've heard something about this
ahead and
before. Yeah, go on, please.
Please go read the study, Attitudes in the Islamic Faith, Pew Research, 2008 to 2012 to 2013, something like that. And they did an exhaustive study. The people who did it wrote it's a masterpiece of statistics works as far as I'm concerned. They did a really thorough job. I don't know if they've revisited the question now that we're 10 years on. I would be extremely interested if they did. But my point is, take a country like Indonesia, 200 million Muslims. And let me backtrack for a moment. The study did isolate for moderate Islam. They did not go to countries like Somalia or Iraq. Iraq, yeah, a little bit, but not Iran. Simply because if they went over there and started asking questions, they'd get a gun in their face. So
I think they did. They did Turkey as well. I think, because I remember talking about this study with a friend of mine, an expat out in Turkey, and talked about some of the consequences of the results of this. If we're talking about the same study, please continue.
Yes, Turkey was involved in it, and the consequences of that study, I think, are part of the reason why we haven't seen anything close to it since then. But anyway, they isolated for a more moderate population. They didn't go to the more fanatical countries simply because they couldn't. There were entire segments of the populations that weren't counted into it. However, in the countries that they were able to go to, and like I said, they did like 38 to 40 countries, depending on how you're defining it. And they talked to thousands and tens of thousands of people. So I figured that these experts are telling me it's a good representative sample. You go take a country like Indonesia with 200 million Muslims, the largest Muslim population on the planet. They asked the first question was a qualifier. Do you support Sharia? In Indonesia, that number came around 77%. So if we take that number and equate it to the population with a plus or minus, that's 144 million people. That's almost half the population of the United States of America in one country that support a legal system based off of a religious code that is 1,200 years old. The further question,
I guess when you get questions like this, I mean, maybe you're about to go into further questions, but sometimes when you ask people something like that, like a headline question, they'll say what they think, oh yeah, of course I support it. And then when you go into the details of what that actually means and what it will mean for their life and who they've got to vote for to do it, they'll actually disagree. Because we see this often with also studies showing supporting groups. You say, do you support LGBT rights? And people will be like, oh yeah. And then you're like, okay, cool. So that means you support gay people adopting. And they're like, and maybe, and that I would say that then they don't support LGBT rights. But it might be similar here, because I do know that I know you were saying they were picking maybe more moderate countries, but like Indonesia does have a part that does have Sharia law, or at least parts of it. I don't fully know, but I think Asa, or I don't know really how you say it.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, maybe we're about to go into detail on that, but I guess if it was like, oh, do 70% of Muslims on Earth support Sharia law? I would maybe want to see more detail than just one question about that.
Right.
That claim.
Yeah. And Brett, what I'd like to add to that is also, we see this in our own country all the time. I support the Constitution. I support the traditional understanding of America. And then you ask them what that means. And you are introduced. Yeah. Okay. If that's what the survey went, because when you ask Americans what their understanding of what the laws require and what we've agreed to in the Constitution, it's horrifying. The levels of ignorance that we see. And was it Jay Leno did that, asking people questions on the street. Now that was doctored, of course, to just take the least informed answers, but. I've had plenty of conversations over the years where people have absolutely no understanding of the legal system that they live in, and that's not surprising. So, but you're saying that the study went into that. So, can you give an example of how it went into a more in-depth understanding of what actually Sharia entails, and some of the more extreme, what we might call, and I think is more extreme, examples of punishments or whatever?
Well, I actually did a statistical breakdown of it on a spreadsheet. I have the numbers here in front of me, and I did this years ago as part of a conversation I was having on a show that I used to host. And the whole concept behind it was to get a better idea of the populations at play here. And I did misspeak earlier. 204 million people as of 2010 identified as Muslims in Indonesia. 72% or 147 million supported Sharia. But like I said earlier, that's a qualifying question. It's a question the statisticians use to isolate a group of people that would have the opinions that they're looking to chart. The next question was, do they support Hunan punishment for theft? And 45% of that 72% agreed that cutting someone's hand off for theft was a good idea. Now, this equates to 66.3 million people, statistically speaking.
Okay.
That's double the population of Texas.
Okay. Well, so let's say all that's true, and I'm not going to challenge you on that because I don't have that study in front of me. What are your thoughts on that? Is it we got to do something, or is it look at how crazy people are, or what are your thoughts? Because I can see a lot of directions this could go. Religion poisons everything is one. Another one could be Islam is the worst religion in the world and it must be eradicated is another one. What's your take?
I think it's more a question of perspective and scale. Okay. I think that most people in the United States have no concept of the scale of what we're talking about when we talk about, and in this case, I'm talking about Islam because I'm working off this one study, but you could do this with fundamental Christianity, you could do this with Orthodox Judaism, you could do this with a whole assortment of different topics. I'm using this as an example because I have such precise numbers from the Pew Research Center's study and their population numbers for 2010, which was the time span the study occurred. So my point is that if you're going to talk about how many people, how prevalent is violence against people who leave Islam, even just as a general number, with this one country, if you're talking about the people who are supporting the death penalty for apostasy, the number of people who are thinking that it's a good idea to kill somebody because they have changed their faith, you're talking about 26.5 million people. Now, let that number unspool for a moment. As a population, if the population of Washington and Oregon got together and decided that anybody who leaves Christianity should have their head cut off, that would be a big deal. But that's just last Tuesday in Indonesia.
Okay.
So when we're talking about these things, we don't use specific enough language because we're working with percentages and not whole numbers.
Okay.
We're working with the percentage of.
I think as a general,
I'm sorry. Go
Brett,
ahead.
hang on. That's okay.
Just as a general point, I think when anyone gives a number that's just in percentages or just in numbers, it can easily conceal the whole data. I mean, you can't, like, it's the classic you can prove anything with statistics kind of joke, is like you see this a lot when there's like, oh, you know, there's a 10,000% increase in something, and actually means there used to be one person on Earth doing it, and now there's like, you know, 100 or whatever. And it's still not big numbers. So I agree with you that when we say like, oh, 20% of whatever support this, then it's also worth saying, well, how many are there on Earth? How many are there in this country? How many are there in that country? Yeah, I don't know if that's where you're going. Is that like your main argument, or?
Well, yes. I mean, we're talking about a group of people. If you take all the countries, the top 20 countries, and just 20 countries out of 197 sovereign nations or 207 sovereign nations on the planet, this one group of moderate Muslims, if you add up the whole numbers calculated through all those countries of people who both support Sharia and support stoning or the death penalty for apostasy, you're talking about a population that's nearly the equivalent of the United States of America.
Okay.
I think that doesn't actually surprise me.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me either. I think that I don't think you're going to find anybody here on this show, both in front of or behind the camera, that's going to say that things in Indonesia and Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia or Qatar are great places to exist for human rights, for religious freedom, and for humanism. We're not making that case. And maybe folks in the audience, I don't think there's many people who are watching this show, except for maybe our Muslim friends who would call in to challenge us. The Muslim friends who would agree with us on many things probably think that it's atrocious, that's maybe the situation there. And I don't know how they do that juggling act, but
call in if you're listening. Call in, because I want to know.
Yeah, I want to hear the justification for it. But I agree with you that using actual numbers, I don't know what the actual numbers are, but using numbers rather than percentages is effective. And I think a lot of people who are liberal, progressive minded tend to not go after Islam. I don't know if that's part of what the issue is, but you did mention conservative Christianity as well. We tend not to focus so much attention on Islam because in this country, in the United States, and I think probably in the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, Katy, it's not a dominant religion. It's not the one calling the balls and strikes on what laws get passed and what you can do with your life. So it's something that happens elsewhere. But as humanists, as secular people, we need to care about these things. I think you're right that, I have it bad because my child has to say, a prayer in school. Well, that's the thin end of the wedge, let's say, in this country. But there are people in Saudi Arabia, half the population is not even a second-class citizen. They're not even considered equals in any way. And so we need to expand our sense of humanity to really care about those things. So yeah, maybe approach local problems and keep an eye on these international issues to try to help. But is that where you're going? Because I'm going to give you the last thought, and we're going to move on to our next caller.
Well, I feel like I am intentionally threw the conversation in a wrong direction simply because I was using this study on Islam. Take any study of a population, especially here in the United States. Depending on the study you look at, between 18 and 22% of the American population describe themselves as none of the above.
Right.
If you want to isolate it down to atheists in particular, you're talking between 5 and 7% of the population. Yep. Well, transfer those into whole numbers. If you're talking about 20% of the population, that's over 65 million Americans. That's
Right.
that's a considerable number of people. And
Right.
so
We're not disagreeing, Brett.
Politics.
Yeah.
When the end point of this, or the perspective I'd like to communicate, is
Okay.
that when you are talking to politicians, when you're talking about to leaders, and you say 65 million Americans disagree with the idea that religion is a major part of their lives, why aren't you allowing Democratic candidates to go into politics who are atheists? Why aren't you supporting outreach
Right.
programs
So-
to non-believing
Right.
communities when you're leaving 60 to 65 million votes on the table?
Yep.
If
So I
Good
think
point.
this is kind of you've brought around to a good point here, and it's kind of what we mentioned just earlier in the call, which is
Mhm.
when anyone just gives you
Mhm.
one number or another, just a percent or just a raw number, you've got to be careful because it can be misleading. But in the same light, I mean, it is a way of communicating things, and you can easily be too upfront. You can be very boring with statistics, and the reality is that people do need to hear shock numbers sometimes in order to just get them listening. And if you go up to your local politician and say, I think we should be listening to atheists, or we should let atheists run, and you say, oh, it's because 15% of this, and they might just switch off. Or like you say, if you walk up and you say 65 million people are voting and they'll vote for an atheist, then that's a very different prospect. So it is worth considering how you communicate things. Like, I'm not at all advocating being deceptive here,
Mhm.
because it can be easy to be deceptive in this case. Because you could go up and like a million is a lot of people, and you could be like, there are a million people who think this, and they'll be like, yeah, but what's the percentage of the US? And it's but combined,
Mm.
when you think of the best way to deliver the initial news and then have the integrity and numbers to back it up as a actual real position to hold as well, I think that's a good combination. So yeah, I do agree with you that just blindly repeating statistics isn't the best way to win hearts and minds necessarily, and
Yeah.
it's worth picking which things you lead with.
Brett, do appreciate your call. We're gonna let you go. I think it's a good place for us to keep in mind that we talk about the 29% or whatever percentage that is in the United States who are nuns, who are not religiously affiliated. Now, those people aren't necessarily atheists. They may well be, crystal lickers or whatever it is that they call themselves these days. People who believe in spirits. It's true, but that's a lot. That's a huge number. Those are people who are not directly aligned with the overall, evangelical Christianity, for example. And there's plenty of people within the religious community who are not evangelical Christianity. They're liberal, progressive Christians or what have you. So you're right. Numbers are better than percentages because they're a little bit harder to gloss over.